Okay, can you hear me? All right, I'm going to call our meeting to order, our special meeting for January 20th, 2021, 12 p.m. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda as amended? I don't know if everybody knows about the amendment.
I do not.
Looks like we're removing B from the consent agenda.
I was wondering, because I didn't see it in the packet. So moved.
Second.
Any discussion?
Is there a reason?
I do not know, but I would imagine Steve can tell us real quick.
We did not have any schools have status changes during the last meeting.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. It looks like our first agenda item is a consent agenda. Do I have a motion regarding that? Don't all talk at once.
So moved.
Okay. And the consent agenda is to just approve consent item A. Is that correct?
Yes, sorry. You want me to do that in a motion?
Or you can just say so moved.
So moved.
You second that motion, Tamara? Yes. Okay. All right, any discussion on the consent agenda? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Okay, motion passes. Okay, moving right along then into our information action items. Our first is levy presentation, so I'll turn it over to Dr. Cook.
Thank you, Chair Brumley. We're very excited to have our amazing Director of Communications, Scott Mabin, here to present a just slightly briefer version of what we're going to be presenting out in the schools and out in the community here for your guys' viewing pleasure. And once again, I would also remind us that you're all welcome to jump in and participate if you'd like to do some of those presentations in the community. We find tremendous value in getting face time out in the community with these presentations. So I'd like to turn it over to Scott at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Cook. Good afternoon, Chair Brumley and members of the board. Happy to be here today to show you some of what we've been working on with sharing information with our staff and our community about the upcoming levy in March. We'd like to kick it off with a short 2-minute video that we recently produced and that we have now out on our website. So first we're going to roll that for you, and then we'll tell you a little bit more after that.
Strong schools mean a strong community. The Coeur d'Alene School District stays strong thanks to ongoing support from our residents. This June, our 2-year the levy funds 25% of the school district's annual operating budget. That's 25 cents of every dollar for teachers, books, and technology in the classroom. The levy allows us to have full-time police officers in our schools, in addition to campus safety personnel at our high schools, school nurses, counselors, mental health professionals. A focus on skilled trades and pathways to new careers. Our levy lets us buy new school buses with seat belts. And it supports music, art, PE, sports, and extracurricular activities. All of this is possible when our community renews our local levy every 2 years. We're not asking for an increase in our levy for the next 2 years. The amount would stay the same as it has for the last 2 years. That's not all. The overall tax rate for Coeur d'Alene Public Schools is going down. As our community grows, the total value of all property increases. This has pushed the school levy rate lower for the past 3 years, and we project it will drop again this coming year. The overall levy rate for Coeur d'Alene Public Schools is one of the lowest in Idaho. Voters have supported every one of our local levies since 1986. Renewing the current levy for another 2 years will be on the March 9th ballot. To learn more, please visit cdaschools.org. Thank you.
So I want to thank Chair Brumley for helping us make that informational video that we did. I think it was right before Christmas break. We worked on that. And that can be found on our website. You saw the link there, and we'll come back to that. It's just one of a number of ways that we are planning to share information, like I said, with our community about what we have on the ballot March 9th. So I will launch into the slide presentation when I see it come up here any minute now. The first thing that we want to highlight, I'm just waiting for Seth to find the slides. We want to talk about the absentee ballot request procedure. There we go. So it's never been easier to request an absentee ballot in Idaho. And here we have a link to that website, as well as a QR code. So if you point your phone camera at that, it'll bring you right to that website. The deadline to request an absentee ballot for the March 9th election is February 26th. And, you know, because we're in a new calendar year, registered voters would need to make a brand new request of elections office to get their absentee ballots for the 4 elections that are scheduled this year. That is, if they prefer to vote conveniently by absentee ballot. So we know Idaho falls short in funding education, and that's why we and other school districts rely on local support to cover this funding gap. And our current levy right now is $20 million a year. That was approved 2 years ago, but it expires at the end of June. What you have referred to the ballot for March 9th would continue or sustain that funding level without an increase. So we're looking at continuing at $20 million a year. Let's get back there. No increase at all in the amount being requested. And again, that's on the March 9th ballot. A simple majority is needed to pass a levy, a school levy in Idaho. Going back 4 years, our levy passed with 79% of the vote. 2 years ago, we were just under 70%. And we've had quite a long string of support from this community for our local levy, going back to 1986. And now the levy accounts for 25% of our annual operating budget. So I'd like to just highlight a few of the programs and services that are supported by our levy. Of course, our school resource officers, and starting 2 years ago, the campus safety officers that we now have in our high schools, as well as our school nurses, mental health support for students and staff. We have dedicated levy dollars to recruiting and keeping quality teachers and other staff in our district, as well as classroom budgets, school budgets, instructional assistants, ongoing training efforts for our staff. Lots here to talk about with ways that those levy dollars enrich the learning experiences of our students. You can just see a few of the examples here. I think we tallied up yesterday that we've purchased 18 new school buses since 2018, thanks to the levy dollars. Technology is another area that the levy supports, as well as I think more than 24 buildings across 285 acres in our district for maintenance. So again, we often talk about how bonds are for building, levies are for learning. The last bond measure approved in 2017 allowed us to build our newest school, Nexa, on Prairie Avenue. We also did major projects at Dalton, Lakes, Coeur d'Alene High School, and Lake City High School. And I just point this out because this is not a bond measure. this is a levy, and I just want to make that distinction that we're not going out for a bond. School districts across Idaho have leaned more heavily on the local levy option ever since a major change in state law in 2006 that essentially did away with the statewide property tax levy supporting schools and attempted to replace that with an increase in the sales tax. But again, districts are allowed to make up the gap, and there is a gap, by turning to the local levy. And I believe we have more than 80% of Idaho districts now exercising that option. But it's not the same as, say, how our city or our county rely on local property taxes. Our levies are temporary. They're approved for 1 or 2 years at a time. And unlike, say, the city and the county, they're not automatically increasing. Any addition to the levy would require voter approval. So I want to talk a little bit about, I think, a headline that we all may have seen recently that mentioned Coeur d'Alene Public Schools supplemental levy, one of the highest or the highest in Idaho. And really that's a little bit misleading because it doesn't portray the full picture of property tax support for schools. So the supplemental levy that we rely on is really one of at least 5 property tax mechanisms available to school districts. We also have, like I mentioned, our 2017 bond makes up a little piece of our tax rate, and I think also a little bit still from the 2012 bond program. So those are the 2 essentially that make up our local tax rate. But there are other options available in Idaho. The emergency levy, we're not using that this year. Plant facilities levy, we're not using that here. And then the budget stabilization levy that's available to a few school districts, and I just looked this up this morning. Boise Independent District is raising $93 million a year using that option. Blaine County, $29 million a year. McCall School District, $5.6 million a year. But most districts do not enjoy the authority for this, and so it's just not an option. So that's why I strike that out. We're not even there here. So what does that mean? Well, we're the 6th largest district in Idaho by enrollment, but when you calculate our local levy spending per student, Coeur d'Alene Public Schools ranks 34th out of all 88 Idaho school districts. So I think that's just important to lay that out. It offers some perspective when you see headlines like what we saw recently. So joining us is our Director of Finance, Katie Ebner. She's on Zoom, and I'm going to turn it over to her for the next few slides.
Thank you, Scott. I'm going to go through some of the tax trends for our property taxes in our district, and I just want to talk about 2 years ago when we went from the $16 million levy to the $20 million levy. We shared that the new construction in our area would fund the increase in the supplemental levy and that school district taxes would remain relatively flat. We're going to take a look at some rate trends that prove that that was the case. This chart here shows the school district tax rate per $1,000 of taxable assessed value. The rate has been decreasing since 2015, a total of 59 cents per $1,000 of taxable assessed value. A further decrease is expected with the renewal of the $20 million supplemental levy down to $1.71 per $1,000 of taxable assessed value. So that light blue shaded bar is our projected tax rate with the renewal of the levy. Here is a chart showing comparison tax rates to the larger districts in Idaho, as well as a number of districts similar in size, and our neighbors are in this chart with the next arrows. So you see that we are one of the lowest in comparatively sized school districts, as well as the larger school districts in Idaho. All right, so there's quite a bit going on this slide, but I want to walk you through this. It's important to know the impact to tax bills in our district. So I went ahead and I took a taxpayer in Hayden in our district, and I wanted to prove that what we said as far as a relatively flat tax impact was the case. So for this taxpayer, I took 3 years of the school district portion of their tax bills. So if you see going from 2018 to 2019, this taxpayer, like many of us in the area, saw an assessed value increase. And this was a pretty sharp assessed value increase of 14%. However, this taxpayer saw a school tax bill increase of only 7%. So with that sharp assessed value increase, they didn't see their rate going up in lockstep with that assessed value increase. So going from 2019 to 2020, this taxpayer again saw an assessed value increase. The total was 8%, and their school tax bill only went up 3%. So the overall tax impact for this taxpayer going from 2019 to 2020 was less than $1 a month. So that's what we're saying when we say a relatively flat tax impact, even with increasing assessed values. Taking a projection for renewal of the levy. So those were past tax bills. Those were actual numbers. Now we're looking at a projection for what tax bills would look like with the renewal of the levy. So we've taken a $300,000 taxable assessed value home. If they qualify for the homeowner's exemption, that would bring their taxable value down to $200,000. Their current charge, so that would have been the tax bill that went out last November, would have been $358 for the school district portion of their taxes. With the renewal of the $20 million levy, the tax bill for an assessed value home of that amount would be $342. So you're seeing that with the rate going down, the tax bill would go down. However, this is if the assessed value remains the same, which we all know that that is highly unlikely in our area. So on the next slide, we talk about if assessed values are increasing. So we took the market average assessed value increase of 10% for the same $300,000 home. And that's taxable assessed value for the home. It's not like what they could go out and sell the home for. That doesn't always match up, especially with the real estate market being so hot right now. The taxable assessed values are significantly lower at this point. So the $300,000 assessed value home with a current taxable value of $200,000, that home seeing an increase of 10% assessed value, their overall tax bill would go up $18. So that's what we're calling a relatively flat tax impact. And that's $18 for the full year. One thing to be aware of, there was a change in legislation. House Bill 103 requires that we put disclosures on property tax election ballots, and we're required to state the proposed levy per $1,000 of assessed value. And so this is our ballot will look a little different this go around than in prior years. So one thing to keep in mind with this disclosure is reading through it, it's easy to, if you just read the beginning, it might feel like this is an additional cost. And the one thing to keep in mind is this is a renewal, not an additional cost. So this is a sample of our ballot language. And the main portion of this that we want to focus is that it states at the bottom, the proposed levy will not change the tax per $1,000. So it may be easy to, get stuck on that first sentence where it states the cost for this supplemental levy, but that's not a new cost. This is a renewal. Any questions on the tax information or the ballot disclosure information? I will turn it back over to you, Scott.
Thank you, Katie. All right, we're back here. So yes, you can vote early in Idaho, but only, again, if you request your absentee ballot form from the county elections office or through the state link that we provide here. So again, the deadline is coming up February 26th. When you go to that link, this is what you see. And I requested my absentee ballot, and it took about 2 minutes to sign up. No paperwork. You don't have to mail anything. You don't have to take anything down to the elections office. They will give you a confirmation. You can even sign up for a reminder, voting reminder, and it'll tell you where you're, if you want to vote at your polling place or your precinct polling place, that'll tell you where that is. It'll give you a map. It's pretty slick. So thank you very much. We have a lot more information on our website, cdaschools.org/levy. If anyone out there who's watching would like to receive a presentation from us on our levy, community organization, business, we're happy to schedule that. Just contact me at the district office. There's my email. We'd be happy to work with any group out there that would like more information.
Scott, can you back up 2 slides? And I would just like to point out that those are called QR codes. Any phone with a camera, you can just put the camera on that. You don't have to have a QR code reader. You can just point your camera at that, and it will take you directly to that website just by using your camera, like the way you would take a picture. So surprisingly, there's a lot of folks that didn't realize their cameras would do that on their phones. So.
Well, thank you very much for
Thank
the
you.
presentation today, Scott. Before I get into any questions or comments from fellow trustees, I just want to give you guys a heads up. We do have a time limit today of 1:30. There are trustees that have to leave at 1:30. I know we've got a potentially heavy topic coming up next, so I just give you that guidance as we move into comments. So does anybody have questions or comments for Scott or Katie?
Just real quick, one question I'd like to ask is just as far as that opportunity for the board to participate in those presentations, are you going to get us some information on that?
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
how we
I'll
can go about
reach out to you, especially if any of those organizations make a particular request to have one or more trustees there. But yeah, we're putting all that together right now and just starting to get connected with some of those organizations.
Thank you. That's it.
Okay, moving on then. Our next agenda item is the category update. And again, I will turn that back over to Dr. Cook.
Thank you, Chair Brumley. We are excited to share with you some data of both our community and our schools since we've returned from the holiday break. We've now been in school now 16 days, I think, is the total number of days that we've been back in session. And if you recall, back in December, one of the things we wanted to do was to get a little bit of data under our belts and see how that return started. And one of the things I would tell you is that is, I think, much to both my surprise and I don't want to speak for Nicole, but I think even to some extent maybe hers, and I'll let her elaborate on that, was that we just haven't seen the kind of holiday rebound since we've returned that we did after Thanksgiving. And so I think there's some opportunity for us to discuss a trajectory and a pathway here as we go forward. Nonetheless, I would share with you that the data that we have right now, if you recall, there were 3 data points that we were watching externally. The incident rate in the community still remains relatively high at over 70 cases per 100,000, and the percent positivity is still also pretty high, if you will. We're still above 15%, and then the rate of hospitalizations also is high. Now, that being said, our internal data does not reflect those kind of similar rates. We're seeing a much lower rate of transmission, if you will, of the folks that are in our schools, and so we've talked about that a lot. The data that you see, we call it the data dashboard sheet, the one that's in your board book that has the blue tints in it. We talk about this particular, Seth, if you could pull that up. It's the one that we use right now to track both who would be quarantined in schools, whether it's staff or students, and the data of what our current rate of positive cases are in each of our schools, and how that is impacting staffing and attendance at each of those schools. It's the one with the blue, different shades of blue. And so and we've talked about because there's some lag time with what we report to the state, there are times in which the data may not be reflective on our local data sources as it is being reflected in the state data sources. And so we've been running that to ground. We've actually been running audits, and I'll let Nicole, I'm going to turn this over to her here in just a second to kind of talk that through. But we've been running audits on that, and we are tracking very well with the state data. It's just that the state data tends to lag a little behind our data. And so I think at that point, I'll turn it over to Nicole to share some of that stuff, and then I'd like to jump in here a little bit and start answering some of your questions and perhaps give us a recommendation.
Chair Brumley, members of the board, thank you for having me. Dr. Cook. Yes, I would like to, the data that we have with the state data, I can talk about that. But also, since we added these documents just yesterday afternoon, and it was late in the day when we did, the state did report more incidence rate data after 5 p.m. last night. So they have now reported through January 19th, and we have seen a sharp drop in the incidence rate, actually, 30 points in 5 days. And so our incidence rate for Kootenai County, when I checked late last evening, it was 50.6 cases per 100,000. So that's very interesting. We did see a bump up after the Christmas and New Year holiday, but it was a small bump and has continued down. So it does appear that our community peaked on December 8th and 9th and has trended down since that time. The state data that Superintendent Cook was talking about there, we are doing audits weekly. That's published weekly, and we have found that if we give them that week lag time in there, our numbers do accurately match for what we're reporting and recording and what they've got for us. In addition to that, we've talked a little bit internally about our data tracking system and the numbers that are posted on our website. We internally do notifications kind of on the daily activity, and there has been some interest in that daily activity matching what is posted on this sheet that you see here for our COVID building tracker. We know that all of this information is self-reported, and so some of the examples on timing of information that impact what's posted where and when and with the state and what we have for email notices and, or I shouldn't say email notices, but daily notifications of activity. When a parent self-reports to us, it goes into our system. And sometimes we have students that are out on quarantine. And while they're out on quarantine because they've been exposed, so they're out on quarantine for 10 days or 14 days, they've tested and they've come back positive, but they don't let us know that until they want their student to return to school after their 10-day quarantine. So we have several examples of those daily. For example, yesterday, 3 of the cases that we had come in have already been cleared to return because they actually tested positive 10 days ago, but we were not notified of it until yesterday. And so sometimes you might see what appears to be a discrepancy in the data, but in the wash, if you will, it comes out after 2 weeks, and our numbers are matching pretty closely with the state.
Can I ask a question? Just when you're saying the state lags behind us, is that an incident rate, or we're not tracking positivity rates or anything?
No, the state is actually just tracking, I guess you might compare it just to raw data. They're tracking the number of cases associated with each school. And I think they're getting that directly from what we're sharing with the health department.
So that's the state data in regards to schools, not the overall state data for the total population.
Correct. So we're looking at school data that's posted weekly, and that's by building, and it's just case numbers. And then we're also looking at state data for percent positivity, incidence rate, and then local data on hospital utilization.
Thank you.
Nicole, could you walk us through this document just a little bit?
Sure. I think what would be of interest would be under cumulative positive cases students. For the subtotal of elementary, we see 101 cumulative positive cases for elementary students. And if you look at the middle school and the high school, we see 90 cumulative positives in middle school students and 213 cumulative positives in high schools. So if we add those two numbers together, we come up with 303 positives in the secondary population, 101 positives in the elementary population. The national data that has been published is saying that cases are twice as prevalent in students ages 12 to 17 years of age as they are in students aged 5 to 11. But we have 101 cases of 5 to 11 with 303 cases of ages 12 to 17. So in our local population, we actually see that there's 3 times as many cases in adolescents as there are in 5 to 11-year-olds. Active cases currently right now, which is a couple columns over, we see in our elementary population, we have 6 students and 6 staff that are out for 10 days of current illness. We have 0 staff out in middle schools and 10 students out. We have 1 staff in the high school and 5 students in the high school. So right now we have 31 active cases, significantly lower than we had prior to Christmas. On any given day prior to Christmas, we had 50 to 60, 70 cases active at a time. And then our numbers of quarantines are also lower than they have been. And the total out of building also, therefore, is significantly lower than we have had. The nurses are commenting that since we've returned from Christmas, the case investigations that we've done, I shouldn't say none, far fewer of the case investigations have had contacts. Far fewer have had multiple contacts. So I think that that is part of the numbers that we're seeing here, with fewer people out on quarantine because of in-school contact. We know that the majority of our students are out on quarantine from personal contact anyways. Probably about 80% of those students that are on quarantine have been exposed outside of school. But lately our in-school exposures have been significantly lower.
Nicole, is that historically the case, that 80% of the quarantines are from out-of-school exposures?
Yes, almost all of our work is actually from personal exposures with parties, get-togethers, family dinners.
Do you see that equal with teachers and students, or are you just commenting on one or the other?
Both, actually, across the board. Most people are, when they're out on quarantine, it's from personal exposure.
And then Nicole, I can't remember, are we counting after-school activities as school activities? So they are included?
Yes, so sports, clubs. If the student or staff was exposed because of a school-associated activity, it counts as in-school exposure.
And then the current quarantining for in-school exposures is based on the current policy, not the The one that's in the packet, the kind of adjustment that the Idaho
That's right.
Department of
It's
Health recommended.
based on the CDC guidelines, as opposed to what was published recently by the Idaho State Board of Education.
And if I might jump in here, if you recall, at one point we had proposed our own policy to talk about how we would handle quarantining with regards to mask-to-mask contact with students that might be a positive case and an exposure to a positive case. And then about 6 weeks later, the CDC revised their guidelines, and we recommended the adoption of those practices. And those are the ones that we're currently living under to this extent. So when you look up and you see on this data set that right now there are a total of 31 current active positive cases with a total of about 170, I think, I'm trying to do quick math here, impacted either adults or students that would be affected by quarantine. Those are now being administered under the CDC guidelines for quarantine administration.
I did put together kind of in one location for my notes about exposures in school versus personal exposure and those students who later tested positive. So students who were exposed in school and later tested positive for COVID right now, since we started keeping track of this data, which was in the middle of fall, 40 students have tested positive for COVID in school related to that in-school exposure. 240 students have tested positive after sharing with us that they had a personal exposure and were out on quarantine. And then 102 students don't know where they got COVID. For staff, we have 23 staff members who were exposed to COVID in school and later tested positive. We have 99 staff members who were exposed to COVID outside of work and later tested positive. And we have 74 staff who don't know where they got COVID.
And that testing positives within the 14-day window of the exposure, or just?
Directly related. So this is, yes, within the 14 days.
Nicole, do we have any sort of data between when high schoolers were in school 4 days a week versus when they were in 2 days a week, and how a shift at that point between the two?
I don't have
Rough.
those numbers
Sorry.
prepared, but I can tell you that since high school students went from 4 days a week to 2 days a week, the number of in-school quarantines was drastically reduced once students were able to socially distance. And I have not reviewed what those numbers would look like from exposed in school and later testing positive. Is that kind of what you would be looking for? How many students since that time as opposed to prior?
Just kind of a sense.
I don't think we would be able to provide an accurate comparison there because we didn't start collecting that data until later in the school year. And I off the top of my head, I don't remember if that was October or November when we started collecting it.
Nicole's also curious about the incidence rate. Last time we switched from 2 days a week back to 4 days a week. And I kind of went back to look, but I couldn't remember the exact date. But it seemed as though it was potentially 30-ish, maybe. Do you have, off the top of your head, do you remember any of those? I know we did middle school first, and then subsequently we did high school, but what the community transmission at that time was?
I do have a graph of that in my office with notes on it, but I do not have it with me.
Yeah, I think it's just something to consider. I know we've seen in the past that the incidence rate in the community has fairly closely mimicked the incidence rate that we've seen in schools. We're seeing that data changing, which I think is encouraging and exciting, but hard to interpret because we had a long period where potentially students were on break and testing, et cetera. But for me, I think that data I would just be curious to see it just as we prepare if we're going to make a change today, if we need to take extra precautions or what we can do to maintain classroom instructional time.
I do know we have looked at our graphs with our incidence rates, primarily focusing on student incidence rates. And we have been able to follow that the student incidence rate does parallel the community rate pretty well. And even been able to pick up on a trend now. We have 4 months worth of data, so it does appear that when there's a dip in the community, we have a dip the week prior, And when there's an increase in the community, we have an increase the week prior.
Right, and I think that was my point in that using some of the data that we've acquired, because I appreciate so much the work that you've done in keeping this data. It's tremendous work, so thank you first off. But I think it can help guide us as we move forward and we continue to make changes to our schedules that we've learned from this data, and maybe, you know, we're extra cautious as we make another move or what we need to do to keep our students in classroom and prevent transmission. I thought one data point that you noted was the number of students who were exposed in school and then the number of students or staff that were exposed in school. And I'd be curious to track that in subsequent family exposure or positive rates after those initial exposures. Anecdotally, we hear lots of stories of teacher getting it, spreading it to family spreading it to their work. And I know our country doesn't have that data and we don't have that data, but it would be curious if that's a question we could ask down the road as we reach out to families. Did anyone else in your family result in a positive case? Because it's data that would be helpful for everyone, not just us.
I can tell you that they are.
They are.
Mhm.
Oh, they are having positive cases.
Mhm.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
You know, in some families, that's some of the frustration with COVID, is that some families are living in the same household and everyone gets it, and other families living in the same household and one person had it and the rest of them can't figure out why they didn't get it. So it's not across the board that everyone is getting it, but there have been second ring and third ring infections.
Right, and I think unfortunately, you know, we've kind of polarized this belief that students get it and they do fine, and luckily I think the data is showing that our students are so far, knock on wood, doing okay if they catch COVID, but then family members subsequently, and we have lots of multi-generational families in our community, how are they doing? And so I think it's important to remember that it does happen. It's not always if a student gets it, nobody in the family does get it, so there is risk, and we do want to protect, you know, our most at-risk community members. You know, seeing that just yesterday, seven people in our community died, it's still real, and we need to recognize we're making progress, but let's take baby steps and let's make sure that we're really intentional in the next move that we make.
Sir, we had someone step in with us. Sir, would you please put your mask on? I'm up here.
I'll be outside as soon as I can talk to you after the meeting adjourns and leave paperwork with it according to the website. That would be possible?
Yes, actually, our clerk can assist you and you can get her anything you would like us to review.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Nicole, or Dr. Cook, I don't know who would answer this question, but we had a document we've used in the past that I think tracked, I think it was case counts or something, like at the elementary level, the middle school level, the high school level, and maybe at the county, it was a line graph that would show those. Do you know which document I'm referring to? Or? And I didn't see it in our packet today, but I guess I was curious on that. If, and I think it was incident rate is what it was tracking. I can't remember exactly what it was tracking. But if we've seen a change in that, particularly at high school or middle school, with the changes in the school schedule, or has it really continued to follow the community and we're, you know, the same number, you know, we're tracking the community data, whether the kids are in school 2 days a week or 4 days a week. And it's really the quarantining that's having the big change.
That's correct. So
Okay, hold on. Sir, I just want you to know, you don't have to leave. I just wanted you to wear your mask if you're going to stay.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
I just wanted you to know, I wasn't telling you to leave. You are welcome to leave that information, but you're welcome to stay. You just have to wear your mask.
Thank you. I need to stand on principle and not wear one, so I'll be outside.
Okay.
I have information that might be conflicting to what information you've gotten, which is apparently you might come to the understanding it's tainted by conflict of interest. And
Well, we'll take a look at what you gave us. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so thank you, Trustee Morse-Rowe. So yes, we do have a document. I just shared that document with Seth. There's a lot of data in it. First thing I would tell you is, first of all, the countywide trend is decreasing to some extent. What we've seen most recently, as would be expected with the time away from the school in session, is that there's been a substantial drop off in the number of positive cases. In fact, to the extent with both staff and students at all three levels, that it's substantially lower than the countywide rates right now. And so I don't know if Seth can hear me right now with regards to that document, but If you can, it's the dashboard tab. When you get a chance, Seth. You good? Okay, so they're going to pull that up here in just a second, and we can talk that through. One of the things that before we get away from that other document, I want to remind us that the reason we built that document was that we felt like we were making decisions almost systemically at points when we had some schools that had a substantial number of cases and other schools that had little to even no cases. And so we wanted to have some flexibility in the way we were administering. And that tool that we've built, that Nicole's team built, was a tool that gave us incremental data by building so that we could take a more targeted approach. And I think that's the first thing that I would want to make sure that we're drawing attention to. And if you would have noticed on that document, I think you've got on your sheet, that every single one of the areas was in the light blue zone for right now. And that's what we would desire. That means that there's fewer cases, fewer numbers of quarantines that would be happening at any one of our schools. So if we can get that other document pulled up, I can show you the differences currently between the transmission rates, incidence rates in our schools versus the incident rates in the county. There we go. So if you look on the lower left quadrant of that, where it says 7-day average daily incident rate for students, the kind of lavender line there is the county, which, if you notice, mirrors the exact graph we had up there for incidence rate in the county. The yellow rate, or the yellow graph, is the high school students. The red graph are the middle school students, and the blue graph are the elementary students. And this is an incident rate. And so what you see is that kind of 70 per 100,000 for Kootenai County, and you're seeing the incident rate much lower on in each of the three levels. And in fact, all three levels are quite a bit lower, I would guess in the 10 to 15 range for incident rate for students, and even lower yet for staff if you look at the graph on the lower right-hand corner. And then, Seth, if you want to scroll up a little bit, you can see the cumulative. This is if you put them both together. That's the total for each of them. So glad to answer any questions you might have about each of those. And we update that data weekly, so it gives you almost like a 7-day average incident rate of each of those levels. So we're seeing a tremendous drop in the total number of incidence rates. And I think that's one of the reasons that we are seeing a difference now, potentially in that when you looked at that other sheet, the light blue sheet, that showed that those number of active cases in each of those schools is reduced greatly. Seth, could you also now scroll back up a little bit? That top right corner is, if you recall, Nicole mentioned that we're tracking the number of cases that result directly out of an exposure at school, or a personal exposure, or unsure. That's where that data is currently being housed, and we track that data. So you can, just relative to the cumulative positives that you see, blue being the bar that describes the number of staff cases that we've had total since the beginning of the pandemic. The red cases are the student cases, and then when it's a known exposure at school, you're seeing that in the very far graph. So that gives you a little bit of kind of a picture of how we anticipate that the risk, if you will, is being handled, whether it's outside of school or inside of school.
Nicole, could I just comment? I would just like to thank you and Scott again for creating this data and maintaining it. This is above and beyond. And so thank you so much. I know how much work and effort has gone into this, so thank you.
Thank you. I would add just that the school district data is live for the week of 1/17. We're only on the 20th. And so that's one reason that you see it dive steeply at the end of the week. That is current to today's information. And so I would expect that the 1/17 data point will be different by the end of the week.
So is that all of your presentation? I didn't want to cut you off, or if there was anything else. Does anybody have questions for Nicole?
I have one last question. I know, everybody's anxiously or nervous about this new variant arriving in our community, B117, and I saw that the state is sending some samples to determine if we have any activity of that new variant. Are they keeping you in the loop at a state level as far as what we can expect if we do find that variant in our state?
No, we haven't received any information.
Okay, do you anticipate we'll change any of our procedures if we do become aware that that variant is circulating in our community, or will we wait for state guidance?
I think we will wait for state guidance on that.
All right, thank you.
Dr. Cook, do you have a recommendation?
So we've talked about this at length, and you know the numbers in your board packet regarding the community, the spread that's going on in the community would indicate that there's still a level of risk in the community that is worthy of attention. The data that we are showing internally would indicate that it might be time to pull the trigger for an adjustment in how we're attending school. And so one of the things that I would recommend is, first of all, I think that seeing that internally what we have is a pretty low incidence rate, that now that we're getting ready to turn the corner on the semester, we'd recommend that we send kids, both middle school and high school kids, back to school 4 days a week at the turn of the semester to continue to monitor building by building using the data tracker tool that we've got. And if we see any indication that there are cases in which we are going to have some challenges with either too high prevalence, either with staff or with students where we're quarantining a tremendous amount of folks, we feel like that would be better to be done at a targeted level. Right now, we're seeing data that are indicative of a lower rate of spread in the schools. And whether that's because of the non-pharmaceutical interventions or that's because changed personal behavior for students and staff, there was definitely a difference when we came out of the Thanksgiving holiday compared to what we saw when we came out of the Christmas and the New Year's holiday. And both, once again, I don't want to speak for Nicole, but both Nicole and I were very, very dialed in on wanting to see if we saw trend data. If you notice in that top left-hand corner, you can see the prevalence of the number of days post-exposure that we start to see those positive cases come in. And by day 14, you can see that we don't see many of those positives being determined by day 14. You're seeing most of those come in the first week or so. And we just aren't seeing that substantial increase after the turn at the holidays. And so it would be our recommendation that as we start second semester, February 1st, that we would start both middle school and high schools at a 4-day-a-week session.
Okay. Do any trustees have questions or comments on the recommendation?
Just thank you. Thanks for bringing us the recommendation, and thank you for all the information that you present to us. We can understand it. It gives us good information to make the best decision that we can make for our students and staff and families. So just appreciate your work.
Yeah, I'd just like to say thank you for the recommendation. You know, I recognize by a few emails that we've had over the last few days that certainly there's going to be some people maybe disappointed with this recommendation and disappointed with the board's action if that's what they take. I think for me, you know, if we back this up 90 days, we probably wouldn't be making this recommendation based on what we knew 90 days ago. I think I'm supportive of the recommendation for a couple reasons. One, the rollout of the vaccine, I think, is an important factor, although not a huge mitigating factor at this point because it's fairly small numbers. I think looking to our neighboring districts that have had at least similar success to us at operating at a schedule that's maybe had secondary in person a little more. And then really for me, the biggest thing is the inequity that we're seeing in remote learning, or that I'm hearing about. And I think it varies greatly by building and by teacher and by student and family as far as what supports they can give or internet access and all those sorts of things. And I think, you know, the 3 months or so that we've been in remote learning at secondary is catching up. And I think it's important, and we'd all agree, that kids are in class as much as possible. And I'm supportive of the recommendation from that standpoint, knowing that, you know, there are risks to doing this, and that we're going to have to monitor that closely. And hope we continue to see students and staff practicing good conditions or good safety protocols when they're in our buildings. And really, I think driving around the community, that's probably the best place they're practicing those protocols is in our buildings. And so I think we've seen that argument in some emails that students may be better off in our buildings because they're not in social gatherings where we're seeing most of our cases, particularly at the secondary level. So thank you. I appreciate the recommendation.
Yeah, I'm supportive as well. I just had said thank you, but I didn't say that I didn't know if we were discussing that, but I'm also supportive as well, and hopeful when we talk about our next topic that we're going to talk about with masks and being in close contact, that maybe that would help with the quarantining, because I know when we did go back to full-time, that was the problem, is what we were having was, you know, classes being quarantined due to exposure. So I'm hopeful that when we go on to our next discussion, that would cut down quarantining for kids if everyone is wearing a mask when they come in contact, which would then keep kids in school, because we're at a point where, yes, I've always felt, you know, our schools are a safe place for kids to be, and it's where they need to be, not only for learning, but for everything that they get when they go to school, whether it's the social, emotional, or just the contact with their peers and their teachers. So I am supportive of this recommendation as well.
I'd also just like to thank you guys for bringing us a recommendation today, and a really well thought out, good recommendation, so thank you. I did have a question that I failed to ask earlier, and do you have any information on how many staff that want to be vaccinated have been vaccinated, and how many are waiting, and what the number will look like by the time we reopen schools? I think there will be staff who potentially have pre-existing conditions who are anxious about this, and I would not blame them for that. And so most of them will not have had their second immunization, but what percent have had at least a first one, and how many will still be waiting, or what level into their vaccination will they be?
We don't have any information on that yet. We know that hundreds of staff have been able to get vaccinated. They've opened up more clinic appointments. We filled them up. Well, the community filled them up. And we know that they'll be getting their second doses around President's Day weekend, and therefore have some greater level of protection 10 days after that. So probably we won't be looking to fully protected staff until March 1st.
But we don't have staff currently waiting that want a first vaccine. Everybody that wants one has been able to receive one.
We are still doing those participating in those immunization clinics.
Okay. I'd just be curious to see if there are any staff that are waiting when we pivot to 4 days a week. You know, who's still waiting, and if they want one, can we find a way to make sure? Because you're right, even after the first vaccine, there's a lot of data that shows after day 10 that they're 95% safer than they were prior to the vaccine. And so if there's staff that are at high risk, if we could please work diligently to get them access to a vaccine if they want it. And secondly,
I was just going to say, I was at the vaccination clinic yesterday at the fairgrounds and saw a number of staff members there. And in talking with the folks there, they were expecting a big day today. I think because students aren't in buildings on Wednesdays, I think it allowed for more opportunity for our staff folks to get in there. So, you know, that was just anecdotal, I guess.
Yeah, that's great news. And I think lastly, you know, I think Casey mentioned that there will be many parents who are elated today at this decision and happy to see their kid back in school 4 days a week. There will be some who are anxious, who have someone living in their home who is at risk, who hasn't had access to a vaccine. And so I would just ask that we continue to allow grace in our attendance policy. I know that was important to Dr. Cook and the administration, and I would just ask for those families who potentially e-school doesn't work, their kid is taking honors class at a high school level, or whatever the reason may be, that we provide grace for them and find a way for them to, you know, get through the next 30, 60, 90 days until that family member or whoever they're worried about in their household can be vaccinated.
Thank you for the recommendation, and thank you for so tightly monitoring where kids in our schools are at. It came in with just some trepidation, especially because some of the letters that we have received have been across the board, like the entire COVID situation has been. And so I feel for those right now who this might be a disappointment for them, but I am supportive for all the reasons that my fellow board has shared today. So thank you for that.
Want to say something, Dr. Cook?
I really do. I just want to clarify and make sure that if anybody's watching that doesn't necessarily know or understand what Trustee May just mentioned, first of all, there are still spaces that if were necessary, we could provide access to eSchool. And secondly, that there are extended absence applications available to any family that feels like that decisions that the district might be making could be too compromising for their family situation, that if those if those needs are there, to just reach out to their building principal or office staff, and we can get them the support and talk that through with each family. It's a case-by-case basis, but I just want to make sure that that's clearly known by all of our families in case there are people in those circumstances that weren't aware.
I appreciate that comment, Dr. Cook. My question was going to be about the eSchool. So you answered that. I know one of our parents had sent an email asking about enrollment dependent upon the change that could happen today. So I will say I am as well in support of the recommendation. I very much appreciate all the hard work that Nicole has been doing in tracking this, the people under you. I want to acknowledge all those nurses and the folks that have really been in the trenches with this. I know as well as Scott Maben has been doing more than just communications in many ways on this area. So thank you to everyone for all your assistance and help. And do I have a motion?
So there wasn't a motion in the packet,
Didn't see one
correct?
in the packet either.
So are we just looking, a motion to return all grades to 4-day-a-week in-person instruction, starting February 1st with the start of second semester?
That would be our recommendation, is that K through 12 would be in attendance 4 days a week, starting with the first day of the second semester, which would be February 1st.
And the day out would be Wednesdays.
Yes, ma'am. Continuing the day out as a Wednesday remote day.
Oh,
So moved.
Okay.
second.
Is there any further discussion?
No, I would just like to, on the day that we're out, Wednesday, I have received quite a bit of parent feedback that if we're going to continue in this model, that Wednesday is a difficult day. I know initially it was, we're going to let the school sit for 24 hours in deep cleaning. Now what we've learned through this after a year is that the fomite transmission is not what we once thought it was. And so if there was a way moving forward, if we're going to stay in this, that we would consider Monday or Friday as the day. That would be a day for a teacher to do remote learning for those students that are out. So just food for thought. I've had several parents reach out and express interest in that.
Any other discussion? Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, so thank you, Trustee May. I appreciate that comment too. I have noticed as well, and other districts do it a little bit different. They're not using Wednesdays, so it might be worth consideration and letting us know the feasibility of that. Dr. Cook?
We'd be glad to dive into that. And, you know, as we, it used to be Monday mornings, and then we wanted to align to whether we were in hybrid or if we were fully in session so that there was some alignment. Parents didn't have to have multiple days. I think, you know, I don't want to ever presume that we're out of the woods on this by any means, but I do want us to start thinking about life beyond and what that might look like. And I think that would be a very good discussion for us to have with the board on what it might look like long term. As we start to think about next year and beyond, I do think there's a very good opportunity for a transition to get that through. But I would also like to recognize the work that our teachers are doing and our administrators are doing to try to keep some semblance of normalcy with our students. And so we would definitely like to get some feedback from them before we started that conversation, but definitely would hope to have that back with you guys here in the next couple of months.
And I would just say, maybe for folks that are wondering why 4 days and not 5 days, just for affirmation of this comment, Dr. Cook, teachers are still needing to keep up with quarantine kids and keep up with COVID positive kids, and as well as keeping their room clean and then touching base with kids that are behind, even in light of our blended learning that's gone on. So is that still a continued need for our teachers?
Thank you for that, Chair Brumley. That is absolutely correct. and we would anticipate under the current CDC guidelines that we would be elevating the number of students quarantined based upon the decisions that were just made. So there's going to be an additional demand placed on those Wednesdays. And so I do think that that's some consideration that we've got to keep for at least some time going forward. And we can monitor that. That's one of the tools, or one of the reasons we built that tool, was to be able to track the number of students being quarantined, the number of staff experiencing quarantine. Even though the CDC recommendations have gone from 14 days to 7 days, that's still a week. That's still a tremendous amount of time away from school. And we've got to make sure that we're keeping those kids dialed in. And it is a substantial burden. It was the number one point of action when our teachers were giving us feedback that they were willing to do the cleaning. They were willing to do all the things we were asking of them, but there's just not enough time in the day to keep those kids up and connected. And so that would be a continued ask for us at this point.
Thank you for that. Okay.
Real quick, I guess it would be my hope, and I think we'd probably share this, that at some point we can transition back to 5 days a week before the school year's out. And, maybe that's not an issue. Obviously, we've got a ways to go maybe before that works. And as we get quarantine numbers down, and hopefully with continued vaccine rollout in the community, the numbers will trend that way. And wouldn't it be great, whether it be in March or coming back from spring break or something, if we're talking about another transition, and maybe we're 5 days a week. So.
Okay, so our next agenda item is, I think Nicole referenced it as coming from the state Board of Ed, but it actually is a document from the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare that came through. And do you want me to introduce it, or was that part of one of your presentations?
You're going to take my whole spiel if you introduce it. Thank you, Chair Brumley. A couple of weeks ago, there was a state board meeting in which the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare presented a recommendation that came from the governor's work group. And that recommendation was to start analyzing quarantining practices when exposure is to a positive case was done while wearing a mask and in classrooms. And this has been, this was the premise of the policy that we recommended many, well, what's it been, 12 weeks, 14 weeks ago, something like that we felt like there was potentially some value in having that conversation. Well, the state board had tasked the governor's work group, and the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare leaned in on that. And so now I'm going to ask Nicole to kind of take it from here to kind of present that, the discussion and our take on that. So.
Chair Brumley, members of the board, Superintendent Cook, thank you. And we see that the document is shared on the screen here. We received this document through the State Board of Ed, and then later through the Health Department is what my reference was there. And it's a pretty simple document stating that students and staff who have been exposed to COVID in the school setting when masks are worn would not need to quarantine or could attend in-person classes. So the COVID positive individual would need to quarantine. And then essentially we would not have close contacts at school. All students at this time and staff at this time are asked to monitor themselves closely for COVID-19 symptoms and stay home and contact their healthcare provider if they do have symptoms. And so that's a universal expectation of all of our staff and students. We see that this, in the closing statement there, does not apply to students who are exposed outside of school. And so we're really probably, again, I talked with the nurses this morning about what's our guess at in-school quarantines and in-school exposures. And the nurses really confirmed that this is probably about 20% of our students who are quarantined right now have been exposed in school or at school-related activities. We see with this guideline some difficulties. We tried this last fall, and we have some We know a lot more now than we did then. To be honest with you, some pretty strong opinions about how this might look. We do not have the resources to contact trace masked versus unmasked exposures. And we know that not all students are wearing masks all day long, every day. And there's some very good reasons for that, like lunch, PE, and bus exposures. We know that there's not as much, it's more difficult in those times to wear masks, or there's not as much supervision and accountability for mask wearing, perhaps on the bus. We also realize that in some areas, more common in special education, some students are not able to effectively wear a mask. Some students don't wear masks. So we believe we would have to contact trace in some areas there. And then also sports exposures will still occur unmasked. So we're looking at contact tracing would still need to occur in sports and in special education, but we do not have the resources to go through and determine who ate lunch for how long with so many minutes. We know that most of our students in elementary are not socially distanced, and so there is going to be some risk there. And now with secondary and high school going back, those students will not be able to socially distance either. We do have some concerns about if this guideline is implemented at the same time as going back to 4 days a week for middle school and high school, we will not be able to share with you what the impact is. If we see a change in case numbers, we won't know why that is. Is it because we're not socially distancing anymore, or is it because we're not quarantining anymore? And maybe it's both. If we're not contact tracing who these close contacts are, we will no longer be able to share with you who was exposed in school and later tested positive. We would not be able to track in process when we believe that there's in-school spread and how many cases per area when we do an investigation. We would end up being able to find that out, but it would be after the fact. So we would be looking at, oh, we've had 1 case, we've had 2 cases, we've had 3 cases. It's going to take us a little while to put all the pieces together. And so it would be kind of a retro case investigation instead of a preventative measure. It would be kind of recording it after the fact. And I have some more statements from nurses on their concerns. I don't know if you would want to go through that now. Also, I met with Assistant Superintendent Kelly Nichols and Assistant Superintendent Kate Orozco, and then was able to meet with Kate and the elementary administrators and discuss with them kind of the impact on what this would be for administrators. And interestingly enough, it was pretty similar. You know, getting as many kids back in school as often as possible is what we want, is what we all want, and we share that goal. But there is some hesitation and reservation. Administrators talk to as many parents as we talk to, and one of our go-tos is that we're following the CDC guidelines, and we can share that information with families and parents, and we can stand behind it, and we can say this information is published, and I can send a link to you, I can send some information to you. And we didn't follow that last fall for a while, and that was very difficult for us. It seemed like we were saying we're going to follow the CDC guidelines until we don't, and then we're going to forge our own path. And there's some concern that that would be happening again. This is a different presentation. The Idaho Department of Health and Welfare has brought this forward with the State Board of Education. So we would be able to say this is a state guideline, but it certainly does not follow the CDC guidelines that are posted for quarantine.
I think I would just add that we feel like at this point we've got a very substantial responsibility and job of monitoring going on, bringing the secondary students all back in 4 days a week. And I think that's, for us, job number 1 is to make sure we can get those kids back into school safely and get staff with those kids in school, keeping the staff safe. And I think I think the conversation that we're going to have to figure out on how best we, both administratively and governance in your guys' responsibility and role is if we were to adopt this, which we're not necessarily opposed to, but being able to watch and see how that first monitoring goes in is the day that we adopt this, we're essentially saying it's just, the default would then be if there is contact, but it's masked, it has to become the assumption that it's going to apply. And we're going to lose some detail in the data if we do that. We might be willing to make that trade. I think what we want to make sure of first is that we can get 4 days a week back in for all kids first before we're really willing to have that conversation. If we continue to see this trend of our students and our staff incident rate being substantially below the community rate in the county, I think we would see that as a place for us to start having this conversation, because for whatever reason that might be, I wouldn't speculate. It's for the health department folks to speculate, but we would be willing to say that that data is no longer important enough for us to need it to be able to make those decisions. And I think that's where we would collectively advise the board that we're a little reticent on this at this point, because we've taken our recommendation has been to take such a large step today. If we were to do both of those, we're going to give away a little bit of our ability to go, okay, here's where we're being successful, here's where we're not.
Questions or comments?
I just wanted to echo, Dr. Cook, what you just mentioned. I think for me, I think it was a big step for our community today, for our students. We will be maximizing instructional time, which is, I think, what we've heard loud and clear our community and parents want. For me, making so many moves in one fell swoop, it diminishes the effectiveness for us to discern whether it's working or not. Our mitigation strategy is working. Is 4 days a week working? And I think, Nicole, you brought up a lot of points that were my questions that I was going to ask you. I was curious about K-5, eating in classrooms. We wouldn't be able to adhere to this policy, and therefore it wouldn't apply to K-5. PE classes, I know they're not as masked as they were. Anecdotally, we're hearing that there's not as much compliance to masking in the classroom at a secondary level. And it muddies the waters. And I think the data for the next 4 weeks is what we really need to look at, and we really need to preserve instructional time. So I'm willing to say, let's do one thing at a time and reevaluate. And if we're successful, then we can bring this back up in whatever time frame that you think would be a fair time frame, and it would give us time to watch this variant, B117. You know, everybody who's reading the news, and I hope we all up here are, this variant has the potential to be 50 to 70% more contagious. And in the classroom with 35 students, that means trouble potentially. And so if it arrives and, you know, it's here, then we need every opportunity to protect our students and staff, because our students will not be vaccinated. And even though we know that they're doing better, we don't want all of them getting sick at the same time. And so I would just ask that we do one thing at a time. We monitor it, we hear back from you, you know, week by week, we see how we're doing, and then we come back to this. And we might see more guidance at a state and federal level in the next 4 weeks anyway, and that would give us time to see what that guidance looks like.
I just have a couple questions. So you talked about how K through 5 is, they eat lunch unmasked already currently. So how would that be any different? I mean, if someone tested positive, we would still then go in quarantine because they're all unmasked. To me, I see this as when there are different situations, right, where the kids are going to be unmasked, but when we're already contact tracing, where students have been exposed, to me, that seems, and I'm not doing the job, so I don't know how detailed it is, that oh yes, they were in PE with so-and-so, they didn't have a mask. My kids have been wearing a mask in their PE class. So I think it's different with whatever they're doing and what exercises they're doing. So I'm just wondering how this would make it that much different from the contact tracing that we're already doing. Because we've been hearing lots of positive things about kids in class with their masks on. More so, I haven't heard many where they're saying they're having problems. So I'm just wondering how that would then be more of a problem. I don't know if that makes sense, but to me, we're going to run into the same thing then that we did when we switched where we're getting full classes quarantined by one positive kid the minute we bring them back. So then we're going to be running into the same thing where we have this many students out quarantined. So to me, I think we need to take a good look at this. Like, I thought this was going to be a positive, like, and how many times do we not hear from people saying, if masks work, you know, and here's the chance to say, I don't know, anybody else have?
I think I see the confusion, and I think what Nicole was saying is that if one person in a room is unmasked, indicates this policy, because this recommendation is under the assumption that everyone in the room is wearing a mask and they're wearing it consistently. And I think what Nicole, and feel free to correct me, is what her school nurses are telling her, that's an impossible situation right now to ascertain. Was everybody on the bus, in the classroom, in the locker room, fully masked? And so I think that was the concern that she was expressing. And it's the concern that I have, that we wouldn't truly have fidelity to this recommendation because we can't ascertain for certainty that every student was masked. And this is clear in saying everyone must be masked for this to be applicable. So that was my concern.
But
And I-
right now, we're going back through whether they're exposed on a bus, in a team sport.
Right, that's what I was gonna say. I mean, we're trying to ascertain whether they were close contacts, right?
Yeah.
And we're making those
We're-
judgment calls. You know, this one's a tough one for me. I think I get what Trustee May is saying and perhaps what your recommendation is. What concerns me with going back to 4 days, particularly at high school, is a repeat of what we saw in October or early November, where we had those cases where either records weren't kept or, caution wasn't taken, and we had 40 kids in a class, or maybe not 40, 32 kids in a class that were all quarantined for one exposure. And, the impact that we know that has at particularly the high school level on students. So that's where I see this, again, as a good thing, because it maybe prevents that type of an incident, and perhaps that can be done just through administration and record keeping and those sorts of things, so you don't have those incidents. The other thing that I guess I have a challenge with is, in particular, I've maybe been hard on some of our state leaders at times for a lack of leadership and a state policy on many things, and leaving it all to local school boards, that this isn't our area of expertise. And here is maybe the first or one of the few specific guidance that the state has issued to school districts this year, and we potentially could be ignoring that. And I guess I would be, if we took a baby step approach, I would be more comfortable with that than doing nothing at all. My preference would be that we adopt this, but I guess I could support if we wanted to wait a few weeks as well. If the recommendation is that we do nothing, I think I'm going to vote opposite of that.
I could possibly support waiting a few weeks, but when we're bringing kids back, and we just voted to bring kids back, there's no doubt that we're going to run into exactly what we ran into before, where we had 200 plus kids quarantined. I don't know the exact numbers. You guys probably do. At Lake City alone, over, I don't know how many positives, but a handful. Like, we're going to have that same scenario. And yes, it's changed from 14 days down, which is significant, but any days lost at this point, it just, yeah. I have to think about this.
I look at it as this is all of us have talked about keeping kids in school being our number one priority, and we finally have, from the top down, some sense of guidance. And I really struggled. I agree we're not ignoring it, but we've already put it off for almost 3 weeks since we've had it, and not done anything, in large part due to trying to meet. But I don't want to see kids out of school. And we know there were hundreds of kids quarantined unnecessarily. That, and I guess for me, I'm hearing that the data tracking may be changing in that dynamic, may be limited in that dynamic. And frankly, for a kid to be in school, I'm willing to compromise on that. I get that our tracking is important. I think we can still do it, but I struggle delaying it.
Nicole, I heard you say a couple times just needing additional resources. And so Dr. Cook, I'm wondering is there a way to solve a resource problem there with contact tracing? Is there a way to allocate additional resources? I know it's hard to hire new people. I get all that, but I'm wondering if to help with some of that, if there's a way to mitigate some of that.
So there's a lot there to unpack. So let me start by first of all, maybe starting with talking about the resources. Resource-wise, it's the layer. It's just there's almost going to be this, okay, if you're a positive and you are wearing your mask, it's almost a defunct, or no, not defunct. It almost becomes there aren't exposures in classrooms. We just have to kind of establish that, because there's not going to be a way to contact trace, did you have your mask on at all times? And so it almost eliminates the act of contact tracing, which would mean then that any data that we would be garnering would no longer be relevant. And so I think the question isn't about additional resources. It's going to be these kind of dead-end interviews that are going to be a challenge for anybody doing them, even if we had lots of people. I think the second thing is that, and I think this is really the philosophical piece on this, is the reason that quarantinings are happening is because we're anticipating that some level of students that are in those, or staff that are in those circumstances, are actually now an exposure risk that actually will manifest as positive. And so if right now it would appear that for every 10 kids we're quarantining as an exposure, or every 10 staff members, every 10 people, that we believe that we're seeing 2 of them develop positives cases out of that, even with masks. And so now, is that because masks aren't effective? That's not for us to decide, I think, to some extent. I think the question then begs, okay, so now if that would be essentially those 20% that would have been exposed, that would have been more likely to have been quarantined if we allow them to stay in a class, because our ability to contact trace them out now is going to be so compromised, do we have a larger impact and an increase in the data of kids or staff that are becoming positive cases? Rather, we would reduce our quarantines, of course. Our quarantining students would go down. We would still have some quarantines that are happening because of sports activities and outside events. That won't go away, because remember, the highest prevalence of those cases are because of personal contact. Now those cases that would have been quarantined out that became positive would now still be in school the entire time. So what would be that impact? And I think that's part of what we're trying to ascertain. We certainly respect that it's the board's authority to make this decision now. We are definitely feeling a little bit of the tension of, okay, we're trying to keep all kids in school and all staff healthy while trying to manage that. And so I think that's a little bit of the challenge. It's not that we want to quarantine anybody. Quarantining is an outcropping of health and safety of the expectation. And so I fully understand where you all are coming from, but we're also trying to make sure that we aren't getting people sick. And I think we've been relatively fortunate to this extent, that we've not had illnesses that have resulted in catastrophic impacts to families. And I think that's part of what we're trying to just manage, is to just make sure that we're not increasing the prevalence of positive cases above where they're already at. We do recognize that it's a board's decision.
So I did commit to a deadline of 1:30, which is in 1 minute. So I apologize for the lack of continued discussion on this. I think we've all had an opportunity to speak in some form, but I need to ask if we have a motion.
I'm going to make a motion and we'll see what happens with it. I'd make a motion that we adopt the K-12 school guidance quarantine procedure from the State Board of Education and Idaho Department of Health and Welfare.
Do you have a second? Brief discussion, if anybody wanted to comment.
I would just like to comment that I appreciated the State Department of Health and Welfare and the State Board work together to create some guidance. It is completely contrary to what the CDC is recommending. And I'd also just like to state for the record that we're third behind Ada, Canyon, and Kootenai for outbreaks in our state. And in this guidance, I think they are imploring us to use the information of our current location to make good decisions. And right now, we can't say with confidence that we don't have an outbreak happening, and this makes me really uncomfortable if our long-term goal is to preserve instructional time. You know, we improved our quarantine guidelines, and I think we haven't ever tried those new quarantine guidelines in a 4-day setting yet. That was during our 2-day hybrid model, and I would be curious to see with the new guidelines if we did continue to reduce quarantines. I would implore this board to give it a chance. Let's give it 2 weeks. Let's reevaluate and see if we're seeing a huge number of quarantines. But if we make too many moves at once, I think we're jeopardizing long-term instructional time.
My preference today would be that this comes back in a few weeks as well. I do appreciate the state guidance, but I do agree with Trustee May as far as too many moves all at once. At the same time, nor do I want to see kids that are not sick quarantined. But for me, I would take a slower approach to all of our changes at once.
I would be willing to amend my motion that effective date would be February 15th, if that makes board members more comfortable. So that'd be 2 weeks after the transition. And of course, we could always take board action to rescind any current board action.
Yeah, I can second that.
I would prefer that we, put it into motion that it would go into effect on the 15th, I guess, is what I would be willing to amend my motion to. And then we can, obviously the board can take action at any time to make changes. So, as to opposed to waiting, because our next meeting's February 1st. It's going to be the first day of 4-day learning. I don't know what we have planned for that as far as meetings after that. And I just see that we wouldn't get to it till the end of February. That's why I understand the stepped approach and comfortable with that, knowing that there is a plan and a date that we would phase in this practice.
I would second that amendment.
I just want to make sure Ms. Towns got the exact motion so there's no confusion.
Ms. Town, am I clear, I guess, on what my motion was amended? That we would adopt the guidance effective February 15th.
I can never get that microphone to work. Yes, the original motion to adopt that lengthy title of this document, and then the amendment to make that effective February 15th.
Discussion?
I just worry without discussion on the data, if we're not meeting and something has changed and we can't hear the recommendation coming from, we heard from Nicole. I didn't get to hear any of the testimonies from your nurses, and I wish we had, because I think they would have been compelling, and maybe you could share those amongst our emails. But I would like to hear a check-in with you before any official action is taken. And it could be on a guidance from you guys or through email communication, but I would definitely like to hear an update from me personally.
Do you want to keep your original motion, Trustee Morris-Rowe, in light of what doesn't seem to change what may be a consensus or not?
No. I'll stick with with the amended motion of February 15th.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Motion carries. So It will be adopted effective February 15th in terms of the Department of Health and Welfare, absent something changing. Okay, I know that we have another agenda item, and I apologize for folks who have waited through this meeting in anticipation of us addressing that, but we have a timeline today. So I am going to ask if we can have a motion to move our procedures and policy for counselor items to another workshop date or to our general board meeting in February.
I move that we move the counselor policy update to our February board meeting.
Second.
Discussion?
Can I get clarification on that motion? We have the February 1st board meeting, and I anticipate there will be a February workshop, and it's likely to be a fairly busy February board meeting, and I anticipate this one could also take some discussion. Maybe we'd clarify whether it's going to be, if we want that on the 1st, or if we would be fine with that being on a workshop in February.
I'd be fine with it being in a workshop in February.
Do you want to amend your motion to have it for a workshop in February? Yeah. Second?
Second.
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you, everyone. Meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Jen. I'd be somewhere too.
What's that?
I'd be somewhere too.
Oh, yeah.